Hello, I am Dr. Rob O'Malley. Thank you for joining us for this session, The Dynamic Past, How Science Helps Give Voice to Silent Stories. This presentation is Faith and Spirituality in Enslaved Landscapes by Dr. Whitney Battle-Baptiste of the University of Massachusetts, Amherst.
I begin with a quote from Bell Hooks. She starts her essay titled An Aesthetic of Blackness, Strange and Oppositional, with this beautiful description. This is the story of the house. It has been lived in by many people. Our grandmother, Baba, made this house living space. She was certain that the way we lived was shaped by objects, the way we looked at them, the way they were placed around us. She was certain that we were shaped by space. From her, I learned about aesthetics, the yearning for beauty that she tells me is the predicament of heart that makes our passion real. Her house is a place where I am learning to look at things, where I am learning how to belong in space. In rooms full of objects crowded with things, I am learning to recognize myself. I am starting from this point because I am an archaeologist of the African diaspora. I often consider how the material of our lives shape who we are, how we fit, and the visual cues we convey to those who can see us. I began my work as an archaeologist studying the landscapes of captivity in the southeastern United States, first in Virginia and then in Nashville, Tennessee. To be specific, Andrew Jackson's Hermitage Plantation. In this work, I wanted archaeology to help me read the spaces where captive African communities define themselves. In many ways, the landscape opened my eyes to remember the many ways I grew up speaking the language of materiality. These plantation spaces are where these folks lived, walked, cooked, danced, worked, ate, sewed, learned, worshiped, loved, and became more, where they died and were buried. The landscapes of our lives are not just shaped by the circumstances, but we imbue the things around us, that vocal relationship between humans and our stuff. How does one exhume all of the minute details that come together to tell a realistic story of the US past, especially in terms of captivity? Well, we have had an amazing array of scholars such as Sadia Hartman, Marissa Fuentes, Catherine McKittrick, and Christina Sharp. And their work with the archives and the geographies that they inform also help us to create the ability to use gender and race in our archaeological lens, at least for me. So right now I will discuss briefly two sites, both from the 1990s, the Levy Plantation in Brazoria County, Texas, and the Charles Carroll House in Annapolis, Maryland. The Levy Plantation, little brief history. It was started by Levy Jordan and 12 captive Africans in about 1848. They were from Union County, Arkansas originally, and Levy Jordan wanted to establish a new plantation. Throughout the antebellum development of the plantation, the primary cash crops were sugar and cotton. Also adding to the profitability of the plantation, Jordan built the largest sugar mill, more like a factory, in the county to process the cane raised by himself and neighboring plantations. Further, based upon a variety of historical records, archaeologists discovered that Jordan also raised and imported captive women and men for sale. And eventually the plantation's crop was not as lucrative as it once was, and the ending of the Civil War did not help matters either. After a series of disputes, lawsuits, and all kinds of fights, there were still emancipated Africans remaining on the plantation and living in the old quarters. So according to archaeologist Ken Brown, quote, from an archaeological point of view, possibly the single most important event in the history of the quarters is that their occupants were forced to leave. A large percentage of artifacts thus far recovered represents the preserved remains of possessions abandoned by the occupants as they were forced to leave. The historical documents do not indicate exactly when this abandonment occurred. Several lines of evidence, including family oral history and 2 civil court cases, however, suggest that it happened sometime in late 1890 or early 1891. This forced removal has resulted in the preservation of an important set of artifacts representing items that were hastily abandoned by their owners. Further, the materials have been recovered in positions relatively close to the place of their use, end quote. The main data from a restricted area of a single cabin of primary importance here that I want to discuss are 5 cast iron kettle bases, several pieces of utilized chalk, fragments of small scale bird skulls, an animal's paw, medicine bottles, bullet casings put together to form a sealed tube, ocean shells, small doll parts, a high frequency of nails and spikes, several tablespoons, metal knives, both real and fake, knives that were metal that was actually formed to create the look of a knife. They also had several objects related to what they called a ritual toolkit of a traditional West African and/or African-American healer magician. As someone who is not only an archaeologist of African descent, but also someone who grew up practicing an African traditional religion, for me, hearing about these particular items was interesting, but it was the placement of these items that was so influential for me and so telling. Because for me, in my house, I grew up with these same objects in a cast iron pot. These that I'm showing you right now are the bottoms. And these cast iron pots were actually found laid on top of each other, which is even more interesting. It was a layering of these items. It was a layering of the container and the items within it. So I'd like to invoke the idea of Ogun, right? So Ogun is very much a warrior. He is a deity from the southeastern part of Nigeria, Yoruba land, and he is a deity that is in control of not only nature, but hunting. He is very strong, but a lot of the tools and implements that would be used to invoke or actually to create representation of Ogun would have been very similar items to the ones that were described by Ken Brown and archaeologists at the Levy Jordan Plantation. Now, these items clearly could have functioned as other things, but in the context of all of them being placed so close in proximity, I am willing, as well as the archaeologists that excavated the Jordan Plantation, to take a leap and talk about the idea that these folks, this is post-emancipation, when they abandoned the cabins, actually were practicing and using tools for their own spiritual practice, which is very interesting. Equipment regularly employed in these ritual activities include, among other items, wooden or metal trays, white chalk or powder, metal staffs, bird symbolisms, and also the use of chalk is very much used throughout the tradition of Odun to create pictures on the ground and to use chalk as a form, as a medium to communicate with deities. These behavioral descriptions clearly help to tie a number of the artifacts discovered in the archaeological record of the Jordan Plantation into what they term to be a functional set. This functional set concerned both curing and magic ritual and ritual objects. However, the ritual objects are not the elaborate and symbolically decorated items generally noted within the ethnographic descriptions. In the case of the Jordan Plantation artifacts, they are simply adaptations of existing European American material culture, but used in a way that was familiar to the folks who were practicing these forms of spirituality. A free community composed of and controlled by its Black and Creole inhabitants versus a community of free Blacks within a larger community controlled by whites in a generally antagonistic setting, one might predict some forms of simplification of the material culture involved. Basically, you use what you have and you don't need much. You just need the intention. And that for me has been a very, very big part of kind of my relationship with not only archives, excavation, but also lived experience. So I'm going to briefly talk about the Charles Carroll House in Annapolis, Maryland. This is a very different type of situation because this was within the main house. In 1990, a group of archaeologists found the first of the archaeological deposits connected to slavery and life after emancipation in the house of Charles Carroll of Carrollton, Maryland. The deposits were made up of quartz crystals, pierced discs, pins, a rounded black pebble, and a white potsherd with a blue asterisk painted in the interior bottom. One of the archaeologists, Dr. Mark Leone, had been digging in Annapolis, Maryland since 1981 and had never seen an assemblage of items like these. And here I'm showing you the basics of what was in what they're calling a nkisi or a toolkit. The discovery was made in July, and in early September, Leone had a small announcement of the find that he printed in the New York Times. That was the Sunday. The next day, Dr. Frederick Lamp, curator of African art at the Baltimore Museum of Art, called Leone immediately to say that the origins of the materials' use and meaning were clearly West African. He explained that the materials would have had to be used only by captive Africans or enslaved, emancipated African laborers living in the Charles Carroll Big House. They could not be anything else. They were used to control spirits who left the body at death and who wandered via water back to the sea. Their ending point as well as their source, which is water. Spirits conceptualized in the West African larger concept, it's a large area, could be directed to perform for humans by using material items that looked like water, death, and flashes of light, hence the crystals. The spirits so directed or controlled could protect, cure, and even shape your future. Dr. Gladys Marie Frye was brought in. She was a folklorist at the University of Maryland and had been working independently to interpret the patterns that existed in artifacts associated with captives being excavated all over the Southeast. Why, for example, she would ask, did so many of the caches contain white buttons? The New York Times article provided a chance for Frye to identify and later meet an on-campus colleague laboring in the same intellectual vineyard. Frye and Leone teamed up and proposed to survey all the narrative information on practices and meanings associated with conjure or doctoring. Then a comparison of the two would lead to a clear view of the dimensions of what there was, as well as answers to unanswered questions, such as, how could one describe this system of belief? When was it used? Where was it practiced? How consistent was it? And how consistent were its remains? Now, they relied heavily on WPA narratives collected during the 1930s, which have come up with a lot of criticism for the vagueness and the idea of the age of many of the folks who were interviewed were children when slavery ended. So this has always been a point of contention for folklorists, historians, as well as archaeologists. However, many of these collected sources commented on Africa, healing, curing, and hexing, protection from conjures, foretelling, root doctors, clothing, the use of clothing, hair, bones, and the whole divine pharmacopoeia of items used to get spirits to handle amulets and life crises. The narratives reveal what is missing from the archaeology and what to look for in the ground, because there's a lot of materials that would not have lasted for this long. So I will share with you the idea behind thinking about those minute, detailed practices that often went unnoticed by plantation owners, even if the captives were living within the household. The actual Carroll assemblage was found in a wall right near the entrance of the kitchen, which came down from stairs. The idea of that protection, the idea that that could be contained, that is the way to control and to manipulate the practices that you know or that have been passed down and given some semblance of not independence or agency. I don't want to amplify or glorify these very minute details. But what I do want to talk about is to really think critically about the kinds of things that we read in documents about captive folk, not from their perspectives, not about the everyday minute details of how to make your life easier, how to find someone, become interested, and make them fall in love with you. All of these kinds of things are the ways in which humans interact with stuff, with material, and with things. And for me, a lot of this is about the circle. It's about what I'm showing you on the screen right now is actually called the Congo Cosmogram. It moves counterclockwise this way. And what it actually represents is the cycle of life. And the cross itself has often been manipulated and used in a way that is the symbol of the cross. But for many practitioners of African traditional religions, it is about the crossroads. It is about in which life and death, spirit and living in the real world intersect. And that is how, for me, I have been able to really engage my own life experience, my own ability to recognize certain things that seem disparate, but are actually related because they are found together. They are found in archaeological excavations where for many years, I have to admit, in many ways might have been overlooked because of the lack of diversity within our field. I hope that I've given you some things to think about. I hope that you understand that archaeology is an amazing resource for not only Black study in the past, but for also to think about how we interact with material, how material defines who we are, and how looking through the lens of archaeology, there is perhaps a new story to tell. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Whitney. We hope you will join us for a live discussion with all presenters in this session at the virtual AAAS Annual Meeting on February 10th at 3 p.m. Eastern Time.